The tires of the SUV crunched gently onto the shoulder of a quiet road outside Harlow County, Georgia. Early evening, golden sun, still air. Inside the vehicle sat a calm man, black mid-40s, sharp posture even in civilian clothes. He leaned forward to retrieve his registration from the glove compartment. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Darius King. He had served 22 years in the U.S. Army. He had trained officers in Belgium, Germany, and Afghanistan. His students led NATO units now. But today he was just another black man pulled over for failure to signal. A police cruiser idled behind him. The siren had stopped. The officer had not approached yet. When the door opened, Darius kept his hands visible, composed. Officer Travis Beck, white early 30s, stepped up with his hand already hovering near his holster. License and registration. Yes, sir, Darius said. He moved slowly, deliberately, reaching for his documents. The flash of a black phone case caught the sun as he picked it up with his registration. A sharp shout. Gun? One shot. Just one. Darius slumped sideways, blood pooling onto the seatbelt he had calmly fastened moments earlier. Officer Beck stood frozen, his weapon still raised. Then he stepped back and radioed in, his voice shaking. He reached. I thought it was a gun. It wasn't. Ever seen someone killed like this? While doing everything right. Tell us where you're reading from, because this story didn't end in the car. Long before the bullet, long before the video, and long before the country knew his name, Lieutenant Colonel Darius King had lived a quiet, structured life. He was not invisible, but he knew how to be overlooked and how to use that to his advantage. He woke up every morning at 5:10 a.m., not 5 o'clock. That would have been too expected. He made black coffee in a dented stovetop percolator that had followed him from Kuwait to Colorado. No cream, no sugar, no rush. He read the paper. Real paper, not a screen. His fingers liked the feel of pages that stained slightly from the ink. He circled errors in red pen and clipped articles worth saving. Next to the toaster sat a weathered photo of his parents. Both had passed before he turned 30, but he still spoke to them out loud some mornings. Routine wasn't nostalgia. It was survival. Darius had moved to Harlow County a year ago. Quiet, mostly rural. It reminded him of Germany, not the cities, but the towns tucked between forests, where everything felt self-contained and timed to the seasons. He didn't tell many people what he used to do, not because he was hiding, because most didn't know how to listen. When people asked, he said he used to teach operations. That was technically true. But what he did mention was the level, the clearance, the depth. He'd spent the last decade training NATO tactical leads in multinational coordination. He'd advised on war games that simulated nuclear breach scenarios. He knew the difference between panic and control, because he had taught men how to think after the first explosion. But in Harlow County, he was just Mr. King, the well-dressed man who bought 2 bananas and a newspaper every Wednesday from the gas station down by the highway. He rented a modest house, paid on time, mowed his lawn with a push mower even though the landlord offered to cover it. There was discipline in doing things slowly. There was memory in doing them quietly. His neighbors respected him. 1 or 2 even liked him, but no one really knew him, and that was fine. After years in briefing rooms where every word was recorded, Darius had learned to treasure silence. He still kept his uniforms, pressed, stored in sealed garment bags, lined like a small museum behind the bedroom door. The medals were in a wooden box, not displayed, just there. Inside, beneath the silver bars and folded citations, was a single photo from 2011, him with a NATO coalition team he had trained, standing in the rain in Belgium. Everyone smiling, so proud. There was one inscription on the back, to the man who taught us to lead without ever raising his voice. On weekends, Darius volunteered at a local community center, helping high schoolers write college applications, especially ROTC essays. He was patient, firm, never overbearing. He taught them to read the room before they spoke. Observe and adjust, he'd say. A good mind reacts. A great one anticipates. Most of the kids didn't know his rank. He never told them. They just called him Mr. D. The last day of his life began with a phone call. His mother's old friend, Miss Irene, had forgotten to pick up her prescription, and her legs were acting up again. Darius told her he'd grab it and bring over some soup. She insisted he didn't have to. He ignored her like always. He drove the same route he always did, County Road 41, past the fields, past the abandoned grain silo, through the stretch of open road where the police liked to sit behind trees with radar guns. Darius wasn't speeding. He signaled. He wore his seatbelt. But the cop car lit up behind him anyway. He eased to the side calmly, just as he taught soldiers in training simulations during convoy stops. Park, hands visible, no sudden moves. But real life isn't a simulation, and Officer Travis Beck wasn't trained by men like Darius King. Let's back up a moment, because the story doesn't begin with the gun. It begins with the gaze. The way Beck had seen the car, the driver, the color of his skin. It begins with assumption and fear dressed up as authority. Beck was young, ambitious. He had a history. Nothing serious, just enough to show a pattern. A few complaints from drivers, mostly black, mostly dismissed. He'd once said to a colleague, off the record, "Sometimes you just know when they're about to pull something. It's instinct." But instinct unchecked becomes prejudice. And that's what met Darius on that quiet Georgia road. Later, people would ask, why didn't he say he was a soldier? Why didn't he flash a badge? A medal? A rank? But they didn't understand. Darius had spent his life earning the right not to need to prove his worth every time someone got nervous. He had served so the uniform could speak for itself, even when he wasn't wearing it. That day, he reached for his registration. His phone slipped on top. Beck saw the black rectangle, screamed "gun," and fired before Darius even turned his head fully. One shot, not a command, not a warning, just fear pretending to be control. The bullet passed clean through his shoulder into his lung. He died before the ambulance arrived. Miss Irene never got her prescription. The town tried to process it. The county tried to bury it. The police department said it was a tragic misunderstanding. They released a cropped body cam clip. No audio, just the flash, the fall. But the full footage leaked 2 days later. It showed everything. How calm Darius had been, how still, how respectful, and how none of it mattered. That's when people finally started to ask, who was this man? Why did he die like a suspect when he had lived like a soldier? They didn't see him when he walked their streets, but they saw him now. Folded flag, military burial, viral outrage. Too late for him, but not for what would come next. The day after the shooting, the uniform stayed hanging in the closet, perfectly pressed, still wrapped in clear plastic, still smelling faintly of starch, wood, and time. No one at the police department knew it existed. No one had bothered to look for it, because to them, Darius King was not a uniform. He was not a rank. He was a body, motionless, black, silent. But the closet knew. His family knew. His unit knew. And soon so did the country. The first person to speak publicly was his older sister, Veronica. She stood at a press conference on the steps of the county courthouse, holding up a folded military certificate in one hand and a framed photograph in the other. The photo was from his deployment in 2008. Darius standing with a multinational platoon, sunburnt and smiling, a field map in his hand, pointing somewhere off frame as others watched. He trained people who now advise generals, she said. Her voice didn't shake. He taught command restraint. He wrote counter-escalation protocols. And he died because someone mistook a phone for a threat. She didn't cry. She didn't have to. The silence in the crowd spoke louder than any sob. By day 3, people had started leaving flags by the spot where Darius died. Folded ones, real ones. One man, a veteran himself, left a framed medal. Another, who had never met Darius, left a note. You didn't die because of what you did. You died because they didn't care to ask. On day 4, the footage leaked. The full version. It spread faster than the press could keep up. Commentators tried to explain, to analyze, but the tape spoke for itself. It showed Darius's tone calm, composed. His movements controlled, measured. His voice clear, firm, respectful. And it showed what happened anyway. Social media ignited. The hashtag he trained them started trending. Because by then people knew. Darius had once led the very sessions that taught escalation management to junior officers. Some of his former students were now military advisors in Europe. Two had gone on to train U.S. Marshals. One had helped write the de-escalation manual still in use in federal law enforcement. And none of it had mattered in those 3 seconds. Because Officer Beck never asked who he was. He never waited long enough to find out. News outlets began digging into Darius's background. The list grew quickly. 22 years active duty. Served in 3 conflict zones. Trained over 800 officers internationally. 4 distinguished service medals. 2 valor citations. He was buried under titles. But none had protected him when it counted. Meanwhile, the department issued a statement. The officer involved is on paid administrative leave pending investigation. That was all they said. No mention of Darius's name. No mention of his rank. No mention of the life lost. Only the incident. They called it unfortunate. And the country called it what it was, unforgivable. By the end of the week, retired generals started speaking out. Not activists, not politicians, soldiers. People who had worked beside Darius. People who had taken his briefings. People who had followed his advice on the ground in chaotic, split-second decisions where restraint saved lives. A retired Air Force colonel posted a statement. Darius King saved more lives than most officers ever get the chance to. And he died unarmed, unheard, and unrecognized. We failed him. Others followed. A NATO advisor released a message. I still teach his risk assessment flowchart to new recruits. His methods made us better. America should have made him safer. Then came the letters. Dozens of former students posted personal memories online. One said, he made us rehearse what to say before approaching civilians. He used to tell us, respect is not a favor. It's your job. I hear his voice every time I lead a team. Another, when I froze in my first deployment, he didn't shout. He waited. Then he said, you're allowed to be afraid. Just don't forget your training. That saved my unit. Now the irony burned. The man who had trained others to pause had not been given the same grace. At a protest held on day 9, a young woman stood holding a cardboard sign. It read, he taught discipline. They gave him none. Photos of that moment went viral. The phrase began appearing everywhere in tweets and speeches on murals. It became a chant. On day 10, the funeral was announced. Full military honors. Closed casket. 21-gun salute. But the casket wasn't closed because of tradition. It was closed because the wound was too deep. And it hadn't come from war. It had come from home. At the funeral, his commanding officer spoke. He stood taller without a weapon than most do with one. And when he reached for a phone, the system reached for a gun. The eulogy lasted 6 minutes. The moment of silence lasted longer. Afterward, his medals were placed in a memorial case. The Department of Defense issued a rare statement of posthumous commendation. But his sister said it best. If this country only sees his value after he's gone, then it doesn't deserve people like him while they're still breathing. The department finally released the officer's record. Beck had failed 2 field judgment evaluations. He had received 2 prior internal complaints for escalated conduct. He had never been disciplined, not once. And now, because of a failure to pause, because of 3 seconds of fear and assumption, a man who had trained hundreds was gone. Not in battle, but in broad daylight, in uniform or not. His body still bore the scars of war, but it was home that killed him. The night before the funeral, Veronica King sat at her brother's desk with a legal pad and a black pen. The room was still filled with him. Neat stacks of field journals, color-coded folders, a single photo taped inside the drawer. Darius at 23, grinning under a helmet too big for his head. The pen moved slowly. She wasn't writing a eulogy. She was writing a speech for war, not with bullets, with memory. Because the city wanted this over. Quickly, quietly, respectfully. They wanted folded flags and muted headlines. They wanted the paperwork done. But Veronica knew what her brother stood for, knew what he would never allow. Silence was complicity. And Darius had never served quietly. He had simply served with purpose. Now she would carry it. The day of the funeral, she stood next to his casket in a navy blue suit, not black. Black, she said, was for mourning. Today wasn't that. Today was about making sure people never forgot who they tried to erase. Her hands didn't tremble when she took the mic. "Let me be clear," she began, voice steady. "My brother didn't die because of a mistake. He died because of a pattern. And that pattern has a name: fear, power, and prejudice in a uniform." Murmurs rolled through the pews. She raised her voice. "You do not get to call him a hero in death if you treated him like a threat in life. You do not get to wrap a flag over the bullet you pulled." People didn't clap. They listened, because her voice had more weight than ceremony. After the service, she turned down every major network's request for an interview. She wasn't interested in telling a story on someone else's timeline. Instead, she created her own. She launched a campaign called Honor Alive, focused on exposing how many Black veterans face systemic profiling, neglect, or violence after their service ends. The first post included a photo of Darius in uniform and a caption that read, "He didn't survive war to die in traffic." The post went viral within hours. Emails poured in. One from a veteran in Ohio who'd been pulled over 3 times in 2 months on his way to VA appointments. Another from a woman in Texas whose husband, a retired Marine, was once mistaken for a home intruder in his own neighborhood while wearing a PT hoodie. A third from a mother in North Carolina whose son was a Purple Heart recipient and still couldn't get through airport security without being flagged. Veronica collected them all, printed them, started pinning them to a board she called the Wall of Unseen Ranks. Not to shame, to show the scope. Meanwhile, she contacted a civil rights attorney, the kind who didn't smile for cameras and didn't mind long fights. Her name was Naomi Beckford, and she didn't ask for a summary when Veronica called. She just said, "I'm in." Together, they filed for a full independent investigation, not just of the officer, of the department, of the city's use of force records, of the training manuals, of the complaints that were marked unfounded and then buried. The city pushed back. They released public statements about unity, healing, and letting the process work. Veronica responded with facts. "This isn't about one bad cop," she said at a press conference. "This is about how the system taught him to pull the trigger before asking the question." A reporter asked if she wanted justice. She answered, "I want change. Justice is part of that, but change is what makes it matter." 1 month after Darius's death, the mayor called Veronica privately, asked if she'd considered joining a civilian advisory board, said it would be a way to have your voice heard. She declined. She didn't want a seat. She wanted the table rebuilt. Amid all this, Veronica didn't forget her niece, Darius's daughter, 11-year-old Layla. Quiet, sharp, watching everything. One night, Layla walked into the kitchen with her father's folded flag in her hands. "Why did they give this to us?" she asked. Veronica knelt beside her. "Because that's what they do when someone dies in uniform." Layla looked down, but he wasn't wearing it. Veronica swallowed hard. "No, baby," but never took it off either. At school, Layla was asked to write a short essay titled, "What Makes a Hero?" She wrote, "A hero is someone who does the right thing even when it's not loud. My dad was a hero because he never forgot to stay calm, even when the world was too scared to look at him right." Her teacher submitted the piece to a state writing competition. It won. Meanwhile, Veronica kept pushing. She demanded the city release the full internal reports on use of force incidents over the last 5 years. They stalled. She filed a FOIA request. They tried to redact. She sued. In court, Naomi stood beside her and laid out the data. Of the 47 use of force reports involving perceived threat escalation, 39 involved Black men. Only 2 led to suspension. None led to termination. One of the officers was Travis Beck. The judge ordered a formal review. The city's legal team called it disproportionate scrutiny. Naomi called it finally. A few weeks later, a mural went up downtown. It showed Darius King in uniform, not standing in salute, but sitting calmly, teaching a group of cadets. In the background, a streetlight. Above him, the quote from Veronica's eulogy: "You can't wrap a flag over the bullet you pulled." No logo, no hashtag, just the image. People stopped, took pictures. Some cried, some got angry, but no one walked past without feeling it. Veronica didn't stop. She met with military officials. She launched a scholarship. She gave speeches not to crowds but to classrooms. She started telling kids the real story, that Darius King was a soldier, that he taught discipline, that he followed every rule, and that sometimes rules aren't enough when the people holding power aren't accountable. At the end of one talk, a high school senior raised his hand. "Do you think he knew this would happen?" Veronica thought for a long time, then said, "No, but he knew what silence costs. That's why I won't be quiet." When the indictment finally came, the words were carefully chosen. Second-degree murder, gross negligence, reckless endangerment. The press release was sterile, clinical, the legal system's version of a shrug wrapped in a headline. But inside the courthouse, people were already gathering, not for spectacle, for presence. Because this wasn't just about a trial. It was about whether America could look one of its own in the eye and say, "We did this, and it cannot stand." Officer Travis Beck arrived with his lawyer, his hair clipped shorter than usual, his uniform replaced by a plain navy suit. He looked smaller in person, or maybe it was the absence of the badge that had once made him taller. He didn't look at the crowd lining the entrance. He didn't look at Veronica. He didn't look at the flag pin someone had taped to the gate outside. Inside, he entered his plea, not guilty. Veronica didn't flinch. She'd already prepared for it. She knew this was how the game started, not with truth, but with positioning. The state attorney laid out the charges, the timeline, the footage. But it wasn't until they introduced Darius's background, not just his military service, but the breadth of it, that the courtroom finally stopped blinking. A prosecutor read from a certified record. Lieutenant Colonel Darius J. King, 22 years in active duty, including 3 overseas deployments. Clearance, level 4. Oversight of joint NATO tactical training, with direct authorization to review and revise escalation of force protocols. People in the room shifted in their seats. That wasn't just a soldier. That was a system builder. A man who didn't just follow rules. He taught others how to live by them. Meanwhile, Officer Beck's defense centered on reasonable fear. He claimed Darius moved too fast, that the object in his hand was dark and angled, that split-second decisions are tragic, but not always criminal. He said the footage was inconclusive under pressure. But every time the video played, it showed one thing clearly. Darius King was calm. His hands were visible. His tone was measured. And he was dead before the officer asked a second question. Outside, veterans began showing up. They weren't loud. They weren't carrying signs. They just stood quietly in uniform, rows of them from different branches, different wars, some with walkers, some in wheelchairs. One held a sign that read, "Respect the rules," or "Don't with a badge." Another, "This uniform trained that cop. Don't let his fear erase our discipline." It wasn't a protest. It was a formation, and it stretched for a full block by the second week of trial. Inside, testimony began. First came the ballistics expert, then the body cam analyst, then the training evaluator who reviewed Beck's prior record. She stated under oath, Officer Beck demonstrated a pattern of escalation. He failed de-escalation exercises twice. Both involved simulated civilians of color. Gasps, not from shock, from confirmation. People had suspected. Now they had proof. Then came the testimony that changed everything. A man in a charcoal suit stepped forward, mid-40s, Polish accent, nervous but proud. He introduced himself, Captain Marek Nowakowski, a NATO field commander. He had flown in from Brussels. He took the stand and said, "I was trained by Lieutenant Colonel King, not in war zones, in how to prevent war zones." He looked directly at the jury. He taught us, never assume. Always ask. Every time. Every life. He paused. I have faced armed hostiles who looked less threatening than how this man was treated. It was the first time Officer Beck looked down. Next came Darius's student from Georgia Tech, a young man, now in law enforcement himself. He said, "Darius taught me never to match energy, only to measure it." He said fear doesn't belong in your holster. The courtroom sat still, not out of reverence, but because they knew. These words had once been given to Beck too, and he'd chosen not to hear them. The defense tried to regain ground. They brought in a psychologist to speak about split-second trauma responses in high-stress situations. But the cross-examination unraveled it. Do high-stress responses justify ignoring protocol? No, isn't that what Lieutenant Colonel King literally trained? Yes. By week 3, the prosecution rested. Veronica did not testify. She didn't need to. Her presence had already testified every day. Every look, every breath, every word spoken by others in her brother's name. All of it was the testimony of someone who refused to let the system walk away clean. The defense offered one final argument. Beck's attorney said, "No one denies this is tragic, but my client did what he was trained to do. He reacted to a perceived threat in the moment." And that's when the prosecutor stood and delivered the line that would make national headlines. Perceived threats don't kill people. Trained fear does. And if your training ends where your assumptions begin, you are not defending the public. You are endangering it. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, the judge asked for the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Travis Beck, guilty of second-degree murder and official misconduct. A hush fell. Then came the breath people had been holding. But Veronica didn't smile. She simply closed her eyes and whispered, "Finally." Officer Beck was later sentenced to 40 years without parole. The courtroom didn't cheer, but outside, the formation of veterans stood a little straighter. There's a silence that settles after a trial, a strange, dense pause where everyone expects the world to reset, to breathe again, to forget. Some call it justice. Others call it closure. But for Veronica King, it felt like fog. The sentence had come. The headlines had passed. The funeral was long behind them. And yet, every morning, her phone still lit up with new messages. From soldiers, from students, from strangers. Some wrote paragraphs. Others just sent his name, Darius. A whisper typed into a digital void, hoping someone else was still listening. She was. One day, a message arrived from a woman in Germany. Her name was Claudia. She was a defense analyst who'd worked with NATO teams in training simulations. She hadn't known Darius personally, but she knew of him. His doctrine packets were still in circulation. "I never got to meet him," the message read, "but I once changed to field policy because of one of his diagrams." Veronica blinked. A diagram, something drawn in the margins of a page years ago, now altering decisions continents away. She replied, "Can you send it?" 2 days later, the email came. Attached, a scanned manual, annotated in red. At the top corner, King 12. That's when the idea started to take shape. Not a protest, not a lawsuit, a living record. Veronica began compiling, not just about Darius, but about every veteran, every public servant, every quiet contributor who had disappeared beneath the noise of the systems they helped build. She called the project KINGFILES, a digital archive of uncredited work, protocol authorship, and the people behind the policies that still shaped how institutions operated. She launched it with 5 documents from Darius's field notes. Within a week, she had over 200 submissions. Some came with footnotes. Some came with scars. A former medic submitted a triage flowchart Darius had helped her design during a joint training session in 2010. "I still use this when teaching civilian EMTs," she wrote. "I never knew who helped create it. Now I do." Another came from a Marine who'd suffered a breakdown during his 3rd deployment. Darius had pulled him aside after training. "Hold your breath," he'd said. "Now say your name." The Marine had done it. And for the first time, the man wrote, "I remembered I wasn't just a rank." KINGFILES grew fast. Military circles passed it like a secret code. Then law students found it. Then public defenders. Then journalists. One reporter wrote, "If libraries hold our facts, KINGFILES holds our foundations." Meanwhile, Veronica's niece, Layla, was making noise of her own. She had taken to writing short poems, not sad ones, but sharp. One went viral. He held the rules, but not the gun. He followed steps, and still was done. They fired first, and called it fear. But what they feared was seeing clear. It was printed on posters at several college protests. One professor called it the most concise breakdown of state violence I've read all year. Layla didn't smile when she heard that. She just said, "I wrote it for Dad." Then came the invitation. The Department of Defense, shaken by the attention, unsure how to respond, offered to name a new training wing after Darius. Veronica declined. She didn't want a building. She wanted policy. She wanted a clause written into every officer's handbook. King Protocol. A mandate requiring 2 verbal confirmations before drawing a weapon during any nonviolent traffic stop. At first, the department balked, said it was logistically complex. She responded with 1,287 signatures from service members. Within a month, it passed internal review. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. In parallel, the Honor Live initiative launched its first national campaign. They called it Voice Check. The premise was simple: a digital registry where veterans and public servants could log how their ideas, designs, or protocols were being used, and whether they were being credited. It was less about fame, more about visibility. Veronica's team partnered with several defense ethics boards. Suddenly, documents started changing. Where once there was source, internal, now it read, protocol adapted from Colonel Darius King, 2012. The letters started coming again. Not angry ones. Thank you notes. One was from a cadet who wrote, "I used to think service ended when the gun left your hands. Now I think it starts when your voice keeps working, even after you're gone." That spring, Veronica gave a keynote at West Point. She wore a simple gray dress. No flag pin. No stage theatrics. She just stood before the class and said, "You will be taught tactics, rules, procedures. But remember, someone wrote them. Someone lived them. Someone died believing they were enough. So before you raise your voice or raise your weapon, ask yourself, am I trained or just reacting?" The room went silent and stayed that way. The final echo of Darius's voice didn't come in words. It came in action. An officer in another state pulled over a man for a busted taillight. He reached for his wallet. The officer froze, then remembered the name. "Sir," he said, "I need you to stop. I'm not drawing a weapon. I just want to be clear." It was the first time that department had ever recorded a verbal de-escalation pause. The officer filed it as King Pause verified. Later, that officer would write in an op-ed, "I was taught to fear movement, but Darius King taught me to respect the stillness that comes before a mistake and to choose differently. Systems do not like being made to apologize. They may bow under pressure. They may concede when exposed. But beneath every reform, there's a reflex, a twitch, a pull toward the way things used to be. The name for that reflex is preservation. And in the weeks after the King Protocol was formally acknowledged, the system began to twist. Quietly, legally, strategically. It started with a memo. Memorandum 428-1C. Subject: Field implementation concerns. Verbal confirmation clauses. From Statewide Police Officers Association. While the King Protocol may serve as a symbolic gesture, field agents must retain autonomy to assess dynamic threat levels. Rigid enforcement of dual verbal confirmation may expose officers to elevated risk and legal ambiguity. It was careful. No direct attack. No mention of race, or history, or Darius. Just language built to bleed the initiative dry through bureaucracy. But Veronica had learned to read beneath the surface, and she was ready. She posted the memo on the KINGFILES homepage with a caption: "Systems prefer flexibility when it protects their comfort. But if comfort kills, then rigidity becomes a duty." Within 48 hours, the post had been shared 2.6 million times. Veterans responded first, stitching their medals into photos tagged #NotAsymbol. Then came retired instructors, posting old training sheets Darius had written. Then lawyers, then junior officers. One wrote, "The King Protocol isn't a restriction. It's a return to thinking before acting, and that used to be part of the badge." Meanwhile, a group of legislators introduced a countermeasure. Bill 33 to 142, Officer Response Sovereignty Act. The language was subtle. No peace officer shall be disciplined for failing to adhere to any verbal sequence if said failure is in response to a perceived threat. Veronica called it what it was: a loophole for fear. At a press briefing, she said, "This isn't about safety. It's about shielding impulse under the excuse of reaction." Reporters tried to spin it, but her voice cut through. If you're scared of being told to speak twice before you shoot, maybe you shouldn't be holding the gun. Behind the scenes, threats began coming in. Not to her directly, to Layla's school, to Naomi's office. Emails with thinly veiled warnings. Patriotism doesn't mean undermining those who protect us. You're making officers hesitate. That hesitation gets them killed. You're going to have blood on your hands. Naomi filed them. Layla, now 12, wrote another poem. This one wasn't sweet. You told him to comply. He did. You told him not to speak. He didn't. You told him to freeze. He stopped. And then you told his family that no one was at fault. Still, the pushback intensified. An op-ed from a retired sheriff in a national paper read, "Not every soldier understands the pressures of domestic law enforcement. There's a difference between rules of engagement and rules of instinct." Veronica sent back a letter. It wasn't angry, just surgical. My brother wrote both. The difference wasn't in the rule. It was in who had to live by it. They came for KINGFILES next. State legislators requested a review of the site's data sourcing. They called it potentially misleading. Veronica responded by releasing every submission's metadata. Verified, sourced, transparent. They went quiet. Then a National Police Foundation released a position paper discrediting the protocol as theoretical. In response, over 70 departments signed a counter-declaration, pledging to pilot the King protocol within the year. And yet, the pressure kept building. News cycles shifted. Other stories took priority. People forgot, as systems hoped they would. Even the Department of Defense began to pause internal use of the KINGFILES archive, citing legal ambiguities around ownership of historical documentation. That's when something unexpected happened. A group of NATO officers, unprompted, sent a joint statement to international press. "We do not need permission to remember who trained us. Darius King's name is not policy, it is legacy." They released their own public-facing archive of his work, KINGFILES International. Veronica didn't know they were doing it until she saw the headline. She smiled, for the first time in weeks. But the structure wasn't finished. They tried a new tactic, misdirection. A community honor fund was announced, offering scholarships in Darius's name. But none of the funds went toward systemic reform. Veronica declined to participate. In her response, she wrote, "You cannot launder complicity through charity. If you want to honor him, enforce what he taught." Then came the worst hit yet. Naomi's firm received notice. They were under review for ethics violations. Fabricated. Anonymous source. No formal charge, just enough to trigger audits, freeze certain communications, drain energy. But Naomi didn't blink. She called a press conference of her own. Behind her stood 12 civil rights lawyers. None of them spoke. They just wore shirts that read, "Ask twice, live once." The strategy worked, not because the institutions backed down, but because they finally realized they couldn't win quietly. The blowback would be loud and sustained and global, and they weren't ready for that. A month later, the DOJ announced a permanent review of use of force protocols. The King protocol would be included as a reference standard, not mandated, but embedded as seed, a start, and no one could unwrite it now. Veronica didn't celebrate. She just stood on the back porch with Layla, watching fireflies. Layla asked, "Will it stop happening?" Veronica replied, "No, not yet." Pause. But now when it does, they won't be able to lie about what they knew. At first, the people who had known Darius King closely said nothing. They weren't hiding. They were grieving. And sometimes grief takes the form of stillness, not because there's nothing to say, but because the words feel too small for the loss. But silence, like truth, has an expiration date. And when it cracked wide open. The first to speak was Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Ortiz, retired, 72, silver hair, stiff posture, still called everyone's son, no matter their age. He had commanded training operations across multiple U.S. bases in the early 2000s, and he had one sentence to offer in a live interview that stunned the country. "If I had to pick one man to teach my own son how to stay alive in a war zone, it was Darius." He didn't elaborate. He didn't dramatize. He didn't have to. 2 days later, a journalist published an op-ed titled, "What They Took When They Killed Him." It was a breakdown of every known training module Darius King had contributed to, co-authored, or reviewed. The number was shocking, 114. 52 of those modules were still in use across military and domestic training academies, including de-escalation, situational awareness, and cultural context strategies in conflict zones. The journalist wrote, "They didn't just kill a man, they deleted a walking library." The article was shared 12 million times. More voices came, some from decades past. Major Vanessa Green, who had served under Darius during his first deployment, recorded a short video. He once stopped an officer from pulling rank on a civilian interpreter in Iraq. Said, "If you can't listen, you don't belong in command." We laughed then. Now I see it for what it was, prophecy. But not all voices came from military circles. A schoolteacher in Alabama who'd seen Darius speak at a ROTC event 10 years earlier shared a story on her blog. He didn't bring medals. He brought a folded map. Said, "Every decision has consequences." And some rippled past the moment. My students never forgot that. Then came the janitor from the training base where Darius had spent his last year in service. His name was Mr. Allen Pope. He asked for no interviews. He just sent a handwritten letter to KINGFILES. He used to pick up coffee for me when he got his own. Told me I mattered. Never forgot my name. Never raised his voice. Not once. I thought, if that's how a soldier carries himself, maybe I should expect more from the rest. Veronica posted the letter without edits. It went viral within hours. Suddenly, people began admitting what they'd once stayed silent about. A former officer posted, "I used to think he was too careful, too slow to judge." I told him that. He didn't argue. Just said, "It's better to be late with truth than early with assumptions." I didn't get it. Now I do. I was early once, and I was wrong. One of the most unexpected voices came from a journalist who had initially downplayed the incident in a rushed news report. He publicly apologized in an open letter. I called it a tragic misunderstanding. That phrase makes my stomach turn now. Darius King wasn't a misunderstanding. He was a mirror, and I didn't want to see myself in it. But it wasn't just words. People began to act. Former students of Darius across the country started organizing King sessions, informal meetings where law enforcement officers came together to restudy the training material Darius helped shape. The sessions weren't mandated. They were chosen. At one of them, a young officer stood up and said, "We're taught to control the situation, but Darius taught people to understand it first. I've been carrying a badge for 4 years and just realized I've never been trained how to pause." In Washington, whispers of legislative reform grew louder. One staffer leaked a draft of a bill, the King Accountability and Training Act, aimed at embedding real-time review systems in officer training programs. It wasn't perfect. It was messy, political, at risk of being gutted by amendment. But its name had weight, and weight is something systems can't ignore forever. And still more voices rose. A former Marine who'd once frozen during a hostage simulation said, "Darius didn't fail me. He paused the exercise, asked me what I saw, what I heard, not what I feared. It was the first time I realized fear is a liar unless you interrogate it." Another, "He didn't treat you like a soldier. He treated you like a mind carrying a body." Another, "He trained me not to shoot, and that saved a teenager's life 5 years later. I never told anyone. I'm telling you now." By month's end, KINGFILES had over 10,000 contributors, each one adding a sentence, a line, a memory. Together, it painted something bigger than Darius. It painted the shape of what institutions had erased. Not just one life, but all the lives that trusted the rules would be enough. And then came the unexpected call. A national training center wanted to incorporate KINGFILES into their cadet curriculum. Veronica asked, "Why now?" The director replied, "Because I finally realized, if I don't teach who wrote the rules, I'm just training ghosts." It happened quietly, not in court, not in a protest, not in a speech. It happened in a budget meeting. Of all places, the State Department of Public Safety was reviewing contracts for training modules, a routine bureaucratic check-in that usually passed unnoticed by the public. But that day, a young analyst, one who had found KINGFILES months ago and quietly downloaded every training document with Darius King's name on it, noticed something strange. An older module labeled Vehicle Stop Protocol, Rev 2011, had been recently reclassified as unverified origin. Except it wasn't, because She had the original, with Darius's name on the footer. And in the margin of page 2, in Darius's own handwriting, was a note. Pause is protection. Speak twice, decide once. The analyst raised her hand. Why is this being marked unverified? Her supervisor waved it off. Old system. No attribution. Clean slate. But she didn't let it go. That evening, she emailed Veronica. Attached the old file. Attached the new version. Included timestamps. And added one sentence. They're trying to erase him. Not just in story, in structure. Veronica didn't rage. She didn't even respond right away. She read it 3 times. Then she forwarded it to Naomi. Within a week, Naomi filed a petition to halt the reclassification of all modules bearing Darius's name or input. And that was when the real cover-up began to crack. Subpoenas followed. Internal email surfaced. Messages between officials discussing ways to quietly decouple the King name from doctrine and active training content. One email read, "He's too controversial now. The optics are volatile. Let's consolidate under neutral authorship." Neutral authorship, as if clarity had no origin, as if courage had no author. The documents were leaked to the press. Headlines erupted. They tried to erase the man who taught them not to shoot. The doctrine theft. Inside the quiet rewriting of Darius King's legacy. This isn't about protocol, it's about power. Denial was no longer sustainable. Even officials who had once distanced themselves now scrambled to say they had no knowledge, had not approved it, would reverse it. One resigned. 2 more were placed under review. A third gave a press conference. He said, "This isn't who we are." And for the first time in months, Veronica stepped in front of a podium and replied, "Stop saying that. This is exactly who we are. The question is whether we're done being it." That clip ran on every major outlet that night. It wasn't just fire. It was clarity, like Darius had taught. Soon after, a low-level employee, a file clerk from a training office in Fort Houston, came forward with something else. A disc. It contained backup surveillance footage from a training simulation led by Darius in 2013. In it, Darius is teaching a group of officers about field restraint. At one point, he turns to the camera and says, "The hardest part of the job isn't pulling the trigger. It's holding your breath long enough to know if you need to." Then he pauses, looks at the room. "If you can't do that, you don't deserve the badge. And I'll say that with my career on the line." And he had, and they took it anyway. But now the country had the footage. The clip became a rally cry. Officers started posting videos of themselves watching it. Some cried, some saluted, some simply whispered, "King." Departments that had once dismissed the King protocol now reinstated it, not under pressure, but out of shame, because the footage didn't just show training. It showed honor, and it made clear what had been lost and who had been complicit. The final break came from within. A former internal affairs officer named Mitchell, who had once signed off on the initial incident review, the day Darius was killed, confessed. He said he had known Darius's record, had even used his training once during an active shooter lockdown, but he was told to keep the report clean. So he minimized the language, removed the word decorated, changed veteran officer to local driver. He came forward in a televised interview, holding the redacted report in his hands, and he said, "I rewrote a man's life to fit their fear. I won't do that again." That was the end of denial. After that, no one could pretend this was a misunderstanding. It was structural erasure, documented, ordered, carried out, and now exposed. The Department of Justice issued a rare admission. We recognize that critical contributions to national doctrine were nearly deleted due to internal suppression. We will ensure all records reflect rightful attribution. All records, every page, every footnote. Darius King's name was added back, but this time it wasn't in the margins. It was in the headers. Veronica didn't speak publicly that week. She spent it walking, thinking, letting the weight of it settle in, because the fight had been long, and what she had wanted all along was not revenge. It was memory. It was respect. It was permanence. Layla sat beside her one evening and asked, "Do you think they mean it now?" Veronica answered, "They don't have a choice anymore." Layla nodded. then added, "Good. Consequences don't always look like handcuffs. Sometimes they look like a room emptied of allies, a silence where applause used to be, a name scrubbed from a wall it once adorned, a hallway where your ID no longer opens the door." For Travis Beck, it was all of that, and more. It began the morning that DOJ released the names of those directly involved in the attempted erasure of Darius King's record. Beck wasn't listed in the initial document. He had already been sentenced, already shamed, but his name surfaced anyway. Because of what came next, the National Police Union quietly moved to revoke his pension, not out of morality, out of optics, no longer in good standing. They said, no appeals granted, no arbitration, just silence. He found out from a letter, single page, no signature, no apology, all benefits canceled, medical revoked, access denied. Beck tried to go to the press. No one returned his call. A week later, the training center where he had once guest lectured issued a public apology, not for inviting him, but for ignoring complaints filed by cadets who had felt unsafe during his sessions. One student recalled, "He told us that hesitation gets you killed. Never said that misjudgment gets others killed too." Next came the symbolic strikes. The police department issued a formal update to its database, where it once read, "Officer Travis Beck, active duty commendations 3. It now read, "Travis Beck, discharged under misconduct, terminated with prejudice, prohibited from public service." They also removed his photo from the gallery of former officers. No press release, just deletion. But deletion works both ways, because while they erased him from their pride, the world had already immortalized his failure. The video still existed. The headlines still sat in search engines. His name was now attached to a cautionary tale used in law academies. A professor at Columbia called it the Beck line, the invisible threshold between reaction and responsibility. He didn't mean it as a tribute. Beck's former field supervisor, once defensive, now admitted in a closed interview, "We knew he was volatile. We thought training would temper it. It didn't. It just gave him permission." The interviewer paused. "Would you hire him again?" "No," the supervisor said, "but we did once, and that's on us." Beck relocated, tried to change his name, applied for work in private security, was rejected by 5 firms. One wrote back, "We don't accept candidates who've been featured in federal misconduct reviews." He tried writing an open letter. No one published it. He tried suing Veronica for defamation. The case was thrown out in 14 minutes. But the fall wasn't just legal. It was cultural. Because while Beck faded from memory, the questions he forced into daylight did not. In a televised debate, a senator once skeptical of reform said, "I may not agree with everything the movement demands, but I agree that if a man can be killed while following every rule, the rules must be rewritten." Meanwhile, Veronica received an invitation from the International Human Rights Tribunal to speak on systemic dehumanization in law enforcement. She brought Layla with her. At the podium, she said, "Accountability doesn't mean destroying a man. It means destroying the excuse that let him act like one unchecked." At a mural dedication in Washington, D.C., an artist unveiled a wall-length painting of Darius in uniform, with one hand raised not in salute, but in a gesture of pause. Below it, the inscription, "Pause before assumption. That's where humanity lives." The mayor attended. A general stood in silence, and on the sidelines, a group of former cadets saluted, each one trained by someone who had been trained by Darius. Legacy moves like water. It finds its way. Back in Georgia, the police department that had once protected Beck now faced audit. The state appointed an oversight commission. They called it the Darius Review. Its mission, to track use of force complaints, to flag escalation patterns, to enforce pause training. It wasn't perfect, but it existed, and that meant they couldn't pretend anymore. Beck, watching from afar, sent a letter to a former colleague. In it he wrote, "They made me the villain, but no one understands how fast it happened." The colleague never responded, but he posted the letter anonymously to a forum of veteran officers, with one comment, "Fast isn't the issue. Unthinking is." Veronica never mentioned Beck again in public. She didn't have to. His name was no longer the story. The story was Darius, the soldier, the teacher, the man who taught people how not to shoot, and died because someone couldn't learn. One final measure sealed it. A bipartisan vote passed in Congress, the King Act, mandating dual verbal confirmation in all non-lethal civilian stops, funding for KINGFILES to become a national public record, an independent oversight committee for misconduct redactions in law enforcement. Signed, broadcasted, archived, forever. At the signing ceremony, Layla stood next to the president. She didn't smile for the cameras. She looked at the bill, then whispered to Veronica. They know his name now. Veronica nodded, and they won't forget. The morning after the King Act was signed, Veronica woke before sunrise. No press to prepare for, no lawyers to brief, no hearings, no cameras, just quiet. For the first time in almost 2 years, she stood at the window with a cup of coffee and watched the light creep in. She thought about calling someone. The team. But she didn't. She let the stillness speak. Because this wasn't victory. This was endurance. That afternoon, she visited the Veterans Memorial Hall in downtown Atlanta. Not for a photo. Not for ceremony. She had a folded document in her hand. It was one of Darius's earliest field notes. A handwritten guide on how to conduct a vehicle stop with cultural sensitivity. She'd had it laminated, and she slipped it into a clear display sleeve beside the folded flag they had given her the day of his funeral. No speech, no announcement, just placement. A whisper into permanence. Across the country, ripple effects were unfolding. In Arizona, Police Academy added a required 12-hour module called Pause and Proceed, based on King Protocol. In New York, the Civilian Review Board integrated KINGFILES into its case reference system, using Darius's writings to evaluate officer conduct. In Berlin, a NATO training facility added a quote from Darius above its main hall. Fear does not absolve judgment. It challenges it. And then came the recruit. His name was Marcus Day, 23, black, tall, still figuring out how to stand in his new uniform. He was in his second week at a state training academy when a sergeant handed him a protocol binder. At the top, Engagement Ethics, Reverend K. 12. He flipped the page and saw the name, Lieutenant Colonel Darius J. King. Marcus paused. He'd heard the name somewhere. He leaned over to a fellow trainee. Who was that? The other guy shrugged. Some dude who rewrote half this stuff after everything went down. Marcus nodded. He didn't know the story yet, but he would, because later that night, he found the clip, the training video. Darius, standing before a group of young officers, saying, "The easiest part of your job is acting. The hardest part is stopping long enough to ask whether you should." Marcus watched it twice. Then he wrote the name on the inside of his notebook. Just the initials, DK, next to the words, "Hold the line with your mind." Back in Georgia, Veronica sat with Layla on a bench outside the state courthouse. They were waiting for nothing, just resting. They hadn't planned to stop here, but Layla had asked, "Can we go by?" Just to see. They sat in the shade, across from the steps where Veronica had once given her first public statement, the one where she held Darius's photo and said his name into the silence of a nation. Now a bronze plaque sat beside those same steps. It read, "In honor of Lieutenant Colonel Darius J. King, soldier, strategist, civilian, killed while following the rules, remembered for writing them." Layla reached out and touched the plaque. "I want to do something like that one day," she said. "Something that stays." "You already are," Veronica replied. Meanwhile, the KINGFILES website remained live. Now government-backed. Now protected. Now archived across 6 servers. People still submitted stories, quotes, notes. Someone posted a napkin sketch of a decision tree Darius had drawn once in a diner during a casual chat with a student. It read, "Choose calm, then choose again. If that fails, don't forget who you are." A filmmaker reached out. He wanted to do a documentary. Veronica declined. She wasn't interested in turning her brother into content, but she offered access to the archives. "If you're going to tell the story," she said, "let it be in his words." The film, released a year later, was titled, Still Before the Storm, The Life of Darius King. It won 2 awards. But Veronica never watched it. She didn't need to. She already knew the ending. Because the story didn't end in a courtroom. It didn't end with a verdict, or a headline, or a law. It ended and began in every moment a person hesitated, not out of fear, but out of discipline. In every recruit who paused because they had been trained not to react, but to respond. In every name not added to a memorial wall, because someone remembered what Darius taught. That was the legacy, not fame, not martyrdom, not sainthood, just change, sustained, subtle, irreversible. One last note arrived in Veronica's mailbox, a physical letter. The envelope was plain, no return address. Inside was a printed photograph. It showed a group of officers standing in front of a building named after Darius. One was holding a sign, handwritten, crude, powerful. It read, "They tried to erase him, but now his story writes the manual." She read it, folded it, placed it in the same file where she kept every note Darius had written. And then for the first time in a long while, she exhaled, not from grief, but from knowing he was never gone. Not really, not anymore.